Hello guys, my name is Melaniya Podolyak and this is Ukrainian Toronto Television. This is our test podcast, one of our first shows, where we're going to discuss most important and very interesting things that happen in the world and Ukraine and everywhere else. And I am very happy to introduce you to our very first guest. His name is Siniša Malešević and he is a professor and a chair of sociology at the University College in Dublin. And he is also an elected member of Royal Irish Academy and the European Academy, as well as an elected associated member of the Academy of Sciences and Arts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And most importantly, he's a person who's dedicated his life to studying, you could say, the very worst of humanity, especially in wars and organized crime. So, Siniša, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Melania, for inviting me.
Great. So, before we begin, you know, sociology and war, that is something that people don't usually talk about, don't think about these two things in common, because when people talk about sociology, they usually mean elections or something, you know, akin to civil life. And you have written a book. You have written a book called Why Humans Fight, The Social Dynamics of Close-Range Violence. So could you tell us a little bit more about that book and about the topic and how, you know, sociology and wars actually relate?
Yeah. So this is a very good question. Much of kind of mainstream sociology has traditionally avoided the study of war. So it's really only maybe in the last 20 years that we have kind of more extensive studies of war, because people now realize much more than war is not something that is kind of happens suddenly and temporarily. Much of our history has been shaped by warfare. So in a sense, war has shaped societies, it has shaped kind of class relations, it has shaped gender, it has shaped kind of the way how states look from empires to nation states and so on. So I've been really studying war for at least 30 years now. I've written a number of different books. Some of my early books focused on the kind of more kind of long-term changes, the way how war has shaped societies over long periods of time. But this new book that you mentioned is more kind of micro-focus. So it focuses on interpersonal context of violence, how soldiers behave on the battlefield, you know, what motivates them to fight, when they're unwilling to fight, you know, how they behave in relation to civilians, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the enemy side. You know, so I'm looking at in different societies, different conflicts, generally how, you know, what are similarities and differences in the way how human beings behave on the battlefield. So you have lots of different interpretations that focus on self-interest or ideology or kind of psychological reasons. But what I do in the book, I emphasize kind of social dynamic, you know, in a sense that, you know, a lot of what happens on the battlefield is shaped by the people who are next to you. So we don't come to the battlefield as tabula rasa, you know, but we are already shaped by certain values and ideas and traditions. And also the whole dynamic on the battlefield influences how we behave and, you know, also how we relate to people that matter to us, like family and friends back home. And, you know, so all of these things that people in Ukraine are now experiencing, you know, on an everyday basis. So this is what I study in different contexts, both historically and in contemporary different wars all over the world.
Could you give us like an example of, so as far as I'm concerned, so you come to a battlefield as a person with some preconceived ideas, the way you were brought up, the way, you know, the kind of person you are. But also there are obviously in this kind of very stressful situation, you know, certain things change you as a human being. So could you give us like an example or a case that you have really studied in that regard?
Yes. Yeah, okay. I mean, I've done in the book, I analyzed many different cases. Some of it are kind of, I've analyzed letters of, you know, different soldiers in different wars, from the First World War, from the Second World War, Indian soldiers fighting for the British Empire, for example, which is really interesting. Nazi soldiers, also what they wrote in, you know, kind of from the battlefield. But what's interesting, you know, is the kind of these cultural differences. For example, I can give you a really good example in. You have in the First World War, Italian soldiers were often recruited very young. So in their letters, you can see how they write home and they cry. You know, there's a lot of crying going on. You know, so it shows you completely different dynamics. And then you go to some other place like Fulani warriors in West Africa, where, you know, they're trained not to show any emotions. So they go to battlefield and they die without showing anything. So in a sense, it shows that there is a really cultural background that one has to take into account to study, and obviously how that cultural background influences behavior of soldier on the battlefield. So there are many really examples in the book. Much of the book, particularly the second part of the book, focuses on interviews that I've done with the former combatants in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina who fought in the wars of 1990s. That's kind of here you can also see some similarities, but also some profound differences in terms of their motivation, in terms of how military units were organized, and because you have initially a lot of Serbian army more or less inherited everything from Yugoslav army, so it had much more powerful military, better weapons, while Croatian army had almost nothing in the beginning. So some parallels with Ukraine and Russia here straight away, but over the course of the war, over 4 years, everything has changed. So despite the big size of the military that Serbians had, internally everything collapsed. And Croatia built a much stronger army because it was much more motivated. There was better dynamics on the battlefield. So there are lots of these examples that are useful for us to understand contemporary conflicts.
So you're explaining how you study all these things, but how does, war and sociology really, how do you do it? How does it coexist? Because again, there's this notion that, the researcher has to be in the geographic proximity, talking to these people. And you just mentioned that, you've been studying letters, right? Which is also, a thing that can be studied. So do you necessarily have to be in the time, in the place to study the conflict, or what kind of approaches are there?
Yeah, so people try to do whatever they can. Obviously, these are not normal conditions. You are limited with what you work. I mean, ideally, you would go and do surveys and research attitudes of soldiers and civilians. Some of this is done. I mean, there were examples of, let's say, U.S. Military had so-called embedded anthropologists. So they would send anthropologists who would be part of military units in Afghanistan, and then they would do research. And there's a really good study done by Martin Ender, an American military sociologist. He did the same thing in Iraq. So he spent a few months with the soldiers. He did surveys with them. Obviously, the situation is very different to Ukrainian, but so there are ways how you can do these kind of direct studies. You can also do the participant observation of everyday life, how it changes. How people try to adjust. How civilians live. There are really good, nice essays already coming from Ukraine about what people do in everyday life, how everything stops suddenly when bombing stops. So you have to readjust yourself. So we have these kind of studies done of everyday life as well. You can also do, as I mentioned, analysis of media. Before we relied on letters. Today, people don't write letters much, but you can analyze, obviously, mass media. You can analyze the social media. A lot of information can be gathered that way about the enemy as well. Obviously, because today everybody, even in the most authoritarian states, there are ways that you can receive some information either through social media or some other ways. So a lot of kind of analysis of war propaganda, can benefit from looking at social media, targeting particularly some websites and things like that. So perhaps now we have more technology to do things which we were not able to do before, because people have mobile phones, they have internet. There is a lot of information out there which people in the Second World War couldn't do. So in a sense, we have to rely on other methods, if you like.
That is very interesting. And I would also like to address something you referenced earlier, kind of, trying to ease us into the next topic. So in your scholarly professional opinion, what is most influential when we talk about a behavior of for instance, soldier on a battlefield? Is it the internal culture of the military, or is it an overall culture, the upbringing in the country? So what could play the key role, really?
Yeah, it is difficult because obviously it differs from society to society in different historical periods. So in a sense, we do live. Our militaries are kind of much more democratized than they were, let's say, in 18th or 13th century, where you had aristocracy at the top, and most soldiers were aristocrats because you wouldn't arm ordinary people because they would usually turn against the aristocrats. So you need to live in a kind of nation-state context where people see other members of the nation is relatively, equal in that sense. So in a modern armies, a nationhood matters a great deal. That it is a kind of source of macro level solidarity. So what is also important is the micro level solidarity. So in a sense, how people identify with their family members, with friends back home, whether that motivates them. So you often see in defensive wars like the one in Ukraine, people often volunteer to fight, because they feel a moral obligation or emotional attachment towards their members, of the family and friends, but also larger community. People are dying, so in a sense, there's a lot of kind of altruistic behavior in times of war. At the same time, there is also a lot of egoistic behavior, often, on the part of the enemy, so these things, combining these micro-level solidarities, which are also forged in times of war when soldiers come to military units and experience battlefield, they build often very strong bonds. So we do have these very strong emotional bonds between soldiers. Often, they would refer to these as, these are my family, people that, and you often find that, and there are many examples in Ukraine as well, people who were injured, they go back home and are, and they want to go back to the front line again, because there's that sense of moral responsibility and a sense of really strong attachment that they have towards their, comrades back in the trenches or wherever they are. So kind of, it is a complex phenomenon, and it's also diverse, so historically it changes how soldiers behave, and it's also dependent on different social circumstances as well.
Interesting. So we kind of automatically went into talking about Ukrainian and Russian war, obviously, and I would like to kind of move away a little bit from the military aspect of it. We will be still coming back to it, but there is this thing that particularly interests me as a person. There is this kind of preconceived notion, probably because of, I don't know, short historic memory or whatnot, that occupation of a territory is somehow just a regime change, that it just, there used to be one governor, now there's another governor under a different banner, nothing really happens. And that's why, I don't know, it's my opinion, maybe why people in the West were so shocked after what they saw in Borodyanka, in Izum, in Bucha and whatnot. And people forget that this is usually what happens during these imperialistic wars. And many people have been asking, why did this happen? Not that killing military personnel of another country is somehow justified, but what drives a typical soldier, a Russian soldier, to commit such brutal atrocities towards regular civilians? What could be your opinion about that?
Yeah. So obviously, in times of war, when one side takes territory, this is never, kind of simple transition of government. It is, occupation is always bloody, particularly in ongoing war. And I wasn't really surprised. I mean, it's shocking, what happened in Bucha and all these other places, but it's not unexpected in some respects. And often what we know from previous wars is that these large scale kind of massacre, killings of civilians can be done either ideologically, so in a sense that this is a part of the ideological program, to generate fear, panic, to get people to leave the land, or it could also be a lack of discipline on the part of the military who is fighting. So in the Russian case, we do see large presence of paramilitaries. So that was very similar in the Yugoslav wars, because a lot of kind of torture and killing of civilians was done by paramilitary forces. So we could see the Wagner obviously recruiting prisoners from Russian prisons, often people who were already known for kind of violent acts against civilians. So that's not kind of surprise that these people are behaving the same way. And often these people are only motivated by money and, kind of getting out of prison and, getting time, getting eventually free. So in a sense, paramilitaries are always the most dangerous. In a sense, they are the ones that
you could say that they are, like the most unhinged, very unpredictable.
That's right.
Do they have some issues with subordination, for instance?
Very much so, yes, because these are not really proper militaries. They are people who are mercenaries, ultimately motivated by money. Often you see a lot of alcoholism and drug use, which is also a factor that plays an important part in which we've seen in previous wars of people committing these kinds of crimes. So that's one element. The other element, the first one that I mentioned, is the ideological motivation. So sometimes you do have that. Obviously, element, dehumanization of the other side is important. And we could see that started with Putin, for many years, but just before the war, his famous speech where he denied the Ukrainian nation, talking about this is invention of Lenin. So this feeds into propaganda, and Russian propaganda is very crude, as we could see in the mass media, and they're very openly talking about killing people and bombing and nuclear holocaust and blah blah blah. So in a sense, this if it comes from the top, it is very dangerous. And we had similar things with Stalin. Stalin was very explicit at the end of the war, saying that Soviet soldiers should be raping German women. He openly said that. And so in a sense, we do have a little bit of trajectory here from previous wars that can help us explain some of the behavior.
Okay, but there was this very famous case. I know I'm trying to unpack a lot of things in a very kind of short conversation. But there was this very famous case of this intercepted conversation of a Russian soldier with his wife, where she kind of explicitly allowed him to rape Ukrainian women. And, she's not a part of a military, she's not a mercenary, she's not a regular soldier, she's not even there. How is it possible for a civilian who is that far away from the conflict get so actively involved in the violence? Is there any ways to explain that?
No, that is a difficult case to explain. This is not a kind of normal behavior of any civilian. We do, that is a thing. We do know a lot about dynamics of behavior on the battlefield. And for many soldiers, there's really good studies done by Randall Collins, an American sociologist, on kind of microsociology of violence, where he shows that for most ordinary people, killing is very difficult. It's not, easy to do that. You have to go over many kind of moral things that we are all taught, and kind of human beings are simply, they have to be trained to be killers, and for that only small percentage of people can do that easily. Most people have psychological issues with this. So when you find an example of a civilian, a woman who is not involved with anything kind of supporting these kinds of things, this is shocking. But again, it's not exceptional, because there are people like that. We've seen examples of that in different wars. We've seen that, in Second World War with Nazis. We've seen that in 1990s with some of the kind of Serbian civilians. Also, even church, which obviously is the case in Russia as well, with the church being involved and the kind of the top clergy encouraging soldiers to behave in a kind of something which would be seen very much as a non-Christian behavior, even from that point of view.
Is that a popular case? Is that, involving church, religion, organized religion, and clergy in, promotion of violence? Is that,
No, that is not. It's not something that is common. Obviously, we did see that throughout history, from Crusades onwards, churches and different religious organizations were involved in violence, but they would often hide, their involvement and would justify this. But the kind of explicitly blessing of weapons and things like that, this is bizarre. This is something that we haven't seen, often. This is kind of quite unusual, because churches have been involved, but less explicitly so. They wouldn't, say that blatantly, as we've seen with the Russian church leaders, often, now expressing support for war and kind of blessing weaponry. And, this is shocking. This is unusual.
So it just begs the question then, does the Russian government kind of apply the same tactics to their civilian population that they apply to their military personnel? Because we have already kind of touched on that dehumanizing enemy is very important to a successful battle, if you will. But is it a good strategy for such a country to apply the same kind of mechanics and the same kind of ideologies to both military and non-military personnel?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is a dangerous strategy in a sense, because if you rely on dehumanization of others, that comes back to you eventually, because you always, everybody's a potential enemy, and that is a problem, with Putin, since he came to power, there was always that emphasis that everybody's a spy, everybody's potential spy. So this has been happening now for nearly a generation of this kind of constant watch for spies, and it's no accident that he's killing opposition figures, and has been doing that now for decades. And anybody who is seen as even a small slight threat, so in a sense that comes back to domestic society. So the whole discourse of us and them, the kind of highly polarized view of the world, which is now part of everyday life in Russian media. There's no subtlety in any way. It's just everything is very black and white. It is reflected in society. Ultimately, it is. And I think, particularly in Ukrainian case, it reminds me a little bit more of the Yugoslav situation, because there are cultural similarities. So people in Russia, now have to be, taught the Ukrainians are these monsters. Suddenly, they knew these are people that we know and understand. So you have to project them as in a completely different light. This is exactly what Milosevic did during the Yugoslav wars for Croats and for Bosnian Muslims. They had to be projected as with Muslims, they were seen as kind of the Islamic radicals and blah blah blah, and Croats something to do with Second World War, similarly to way how Ukraine has been portrayed, using these imagery of Nazism and everything else, just to alienate people, essentially to say Ukrainians are not the people that you knew. These are some really completely different people. They're monsters. So that's what dehumanization does. Yeah.
So if to look back onto history, kind of close that topic, how successful are these strategies? Is it going to actually help somehow Russia in this war? Is it this a successful way to achieve their goals, or does these things usually bound to fail?
Yeah. No, I mean, if you look at war propaganda historically, often, scholars differentiate between so-called white propaganda and black propaganda. So white propaganda is based on truthful information, but it's spin, it puts a certain spin. And while the black propaganda essentially is misinformation, lies. And you are much, it's much better if you rely on the white propaganda, if you use truthful information, but kind of present it in a light that supports your own cause. It seems to me that in Russia, they rely almost completely on the black propaganda, and it's very crude propaganda. So if you look from, as an outsider, from the outside, if you look at the way how Ukrainian mass media presents this war and how Russian media presents, it's completely different, two different worlds. Russian propaganda is very crude. It's very ineffective. I don't know that anybody can buy anything. I mean, it's just simply not effective. I don't really know how Russian population can buy this either. I imagine a lot of people who think for themselves couldn't possibly trust many of these things, but because these narratives keep changing constantly, it's not.
We're going to come back to that a little bit later, because we're touching on a very sensitive topic and a very interesting part of it. But you see, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because, well, to you as a person who's been studying this, as a person who's used to living in this, open society, to you it sounds crude and looks a bit ineffective. But if we look at it from a perspective of the society, where Russians live, maybe there's not really, it's not something surprising that kind of works.
Yeah, I mean, it could also be, depending on which society you're talking about. You're right. In a liberal kind of democracy, you're used to receiving information, from different mass media and different information. So you try to, you look at different news and you trust things which you think this is a credible information. In authoritarian states, obviously, you don't have that option. You don't have that luxury. So often, mass media in authoritarian settings operate as a kind of set of traffic lights. So in a sense, they tell you what you should think. This is a red light, so you cannot go this is a taboo. This is something you don't discuss. this is a green light. This is what you can say. This is what you are allowed. I mean, China is really good in that respect because they are being authoritarian state for so many years. And I remember when I was in China, talking with different sociologists, they tell you exactly, what actually this means. So the state sends certain messages to people what they are allowed to talk about. So I imagine Russia has a lot of that. It is an authoritarian state. There are things you cannot say, and mass media probably doesn't work in a way as it works in liberal democracies. So it's.
But is it the government sending signals, or is it people kind of self-censoring?
No, I'm sure there's a lot of self-censoring because you had that, for many years. I mean, Russia had a very short period of democracy, even if you can call that during the Yeltsin period. Before that, it was an authoritarian state, and it has been an authoritarian state under Putin, and it has become more and more authoritarian from, late 90s, So it is dangerous. I mean, he's killing the opponents. He's closing down, and has been doing that for 20 years now, essentially destroying civil society. So anybody who was a kind of critical has left Russia, or is underground somewhere. So it's very difficult to have a civil society in an authoritarian state. It's kind of particularly in the context of war, where you cannot say anything really ultimately.
Well,
this is obviously not to justify lack of behavior on the part of Russian population, because there is a large population of Russian middle class which has always been kind of in tune with Putin, because there was some sort of a bargain that they've signed with him. They will not be political as long as their growth improves, their living standards go up, which has happened from late 90s until perhaps 2005-10. So that people, this large section of middle class is attached with the system. They're ultimately part of the system. So for them, truth doesn't really matter. I mean, they might be aware what's happening, but it's as long as it's beneficial for them, they will not go against the regime. While other people, sure.
Just in that case, if we have a government that is sending a very clear signals to the population what they can and cannot say, and we also have largely the self-censoring tradition and these pacts between these cohorts of people with the government and all of that. And then I see a lot of people, especially in the West, a lot of journalists, media professionals who constantly refer to, certain numbers, like this amount of people and this percentage of people in Russia support Putin, support war. How can we really trust those numbers? And do we actually even know anything about them if both, people censor themselves, the government, do what they do? Maybe so can even, the sociological, coming back to the topic of our kind of conversation, can these numbers even be trusted? Can we with, clear conscience ever say that we actually know what's going on there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question, because, the simple answer would be no, we cannot trust it, because, in authoritarian states, the only way that you can see a kind of dissatisfaction with the government is through mass mobilization. So often the only way that something, when you have thousands of people on the streets, then you see that they are unhappy with the current regime. The polls cannot be trusted precisely for these reasons. The people do self-censor themselves, and if you say something against the war, you'll go to prison. A lot of people have become highly depoliticized over the last 20 years. I mean, this is what Putin's regime has done. There's this coercive pacification that has happened in the last 20 years. So essentially, people tried to avoid talking about politics, trying to kind of remove themselves from that until the moment that it affects them. And that will be happening more and more in Russia. Obviously, once they start mobilizing the middle class, sons of middle class people, which will be coming probably soon, because they don't have that many soldiers, that will affect them. So that it is that moment that things might change in Russia.
So I was just going to assumed this. So we cannot trust the numbers. And you said, and I completely agree, that the only way in such a country to see some dissatisfaction with the current situation is, when people mobilize and say no. Well, we can't see that either now. So the only question I have, just, basing my assumptions on these very fragile, these assumptions, can nations be innately violent? Is that a thing that exists? Can we say that about a culture that, kind of, for now, we see, these numbers that we know we can't really trust, but we don't see, the public dissatisfaction with the situation. So is it possible it's just a part of the culture?
No, I mean, we cannot say the nations are violent, but we cannot, obviously violence is an attribute of individuals, and the responsibility is often, you have to identify particular individuals, particular groups, or particular social organizations. But we do have historical examples of societies that have been very militaristic, like Prussia. 19th century Prussia was a small society, but was at war all the time, and much of its population was primed and educated and socialized to kind of tolerate violence, to do everything for the state. State was seen as this kind of godlike creature, and the state also found a way to. It was also an authoritarian state and banned political parties, but it was the first state that introduced welfare provisions. For example, that was the way for state to buy off population. You will not be political. You will be loyal to the state. You will be loyal to the ruler. You will be militaristic. You will fight. And it was a small state with enormous army. So that was the mechanism to maintain this, kind of culture, which was fairly tolerant towards violence. Elements of that are present in Russia. We do have obviously long history of a society that was authoritarian, ruled by, initially by monarchs, then by, during the Soviet times by, kind of communist party. So that element is important. Obviously, it has played part. This is not to say that society cannot change. I mean, Ukraine was obviously under the Soviet Union, but it changed. It transformed, and particularly in the last few years, things have changed dramatically. So it is possible for society to change. So I said one of the ways for a Russian society to change is, historically revolutions played an important part, obviously, in Russian society. But revolutions happen because there is a conflict at the top. Within the elite. And once that emerges, then there is an opening for mass mobilization that one elite does against the other elite. So that's a way for authoritarian states to transform or to collapse. Authoritarian states from the outside often look as, kind of this monolithic, powerful entity, but they can easily collapse. We've seen that in revolutions over the years. Revolutions, kind of happen suddenly, almost overnight, and things collapse. So Russia can do that. I mean, this can happen in Russia.
Well, I'm not the one to make prognosis about Russia's collapse, because that's not my profession. However, though, there is another thing that is very interesting to me in that regard, is that I tend to call it this, Russian cult of death, how they are celebrating World War II, unlike the rest of the world who are saying never again. Russians usually say, можем повторить, we can do it again. And then you see all these children wearing all these papier-mâché tanks to school, celebrating mass murder of many people. And it just kind of makes you think that, maybe it's not just, self-censoring. Maybe it's not just, the typical sending the signals. Maybe that's just a part of the way they were brought up. Maybe that's the part of the... What do you think about this kind of phenomenon? Does that kind of let us know that this is nations' choice to celebrate that, or were they really that conditioned into it?
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you in a sense that, there are cultural differences in that some societies do maintain these militaristic kind of the whole reinterpretation of the past, of the heritage, through militaristic lenses, if you like. And we've seen that, very much kind of in North Korea, that is a part of how state operates. The state constantly does that. There's all this kind of militaristic mobilization and extreme nationalist interpretation of the past and of the, environment around them. Elements of that are also integral to China, although China has changed with economic development. Russia has that. It's not, it's not unusual to see that has intensified under Putin, particularly in the last perhaps 15 years. It has become much more integral, from the primary school, from the secondary school, even in the colleges. So it is a state project that uses some of the kind of legacies of the past in a particular way. So I don't know. Obviously that plays a part in mobilizing people and in justifying what Russian military is doing elsewhere. But I still think this can change. I think this can collapse. It's not that this is predetermined and it's fixed and it's forever. Sometimes some people obviously believe in this, but there is a lot of people who are just using that for their own, self-interest and, go along with the narrative, or what is a narrative. But there are people who are strong believers in this. That's true. It's not a...
So just to kind of sum it up and coming back to, the topic of violence, which I know I don't really enjoy, conversation, speculating about the future is, kind of an ungrateful thing to do. However, you've been studying this for a very, very long time. So we've kind of discussed, the situation at home, people being dissatisfied with it and, potentially mobilizing or not. However, we do also talk about long-term effects of military violence. And whenever we talk about this, we mostly talk about the survivors, right? But what is to expect for people at home in Russia when all of these men who have been to Ukraine committing these atrocities come home? What are the long-term effects for society, after, because again, war in Ukraine has there hasn't been a war that was so well documented. It's, you can see the pictures, you can see the videos, and it's horrifying. What is to expect after that? Can a society function with witnessing that much violence from their members?
Yes. No, I think that's also a very good question. Judging from the previous wars and previous experiences, you do have that, there are obviously in societies like Russia, where the soldiers were involved in all sorts of terrible things. You often see suicides, increase in the number of suicides. You see violence, domestic violence increasing dramatically. You see, robberies and crimes and killings happening in the streets. Legacy of every war, that people who come from the war, they are, it's a traumatic experience. Society has to deal with them, and sometimes some societies don't deal with this. So I don't expect this, because we are talking here about huge numbers of people who will be in this situation when they come back. Those who do come back to Russia. So I said there's a lot of this violence on the individual level that is likely to happen, but there could be a collective violence in terms that, veterans can organize themselves. They can be pressure group, they can be, kind of gangs, which we did see after the, Soviet collapse in Afghanistan, how a lot of these gangs were formed from people who used to be soldiers in Afghanistan. So a lot of these things, they will be threat to the regime, if there is a regime there after this war, so in a sense, it's not looking very good for Russia from whichever angle you look, because it will be much weaker state, it will be more impoverished state, it will be, so in a sense, it's there will be many more things for Russian society to deal with after this war.
And kind of to zoom out, and this question is very important for a lot of Ukrainians and for me especially. I have read your interviews before our conversation, and in one of your interviews you said that since the end of the Second World War, the borders of nation states had acquired an almost sacrosanct status, and as such cannot be changed without the consent of the people living in these states. And that Putin might be able to occupy Ukraine for a while, but such imperial conquests do not have legitimacy in the modern world. However, it sometimes seems to us, to Ukrainians, that, a lot of Western leaders would not be too opposed to letting Russia, keep Crimea and occupy it forever, and in exchange for some sort of temporary peace, what we have currently. I mean, the rhetoric is full of concerns regarding, Ukraine trying to take back Crimea, and a lot of people or a lot of politicians are using this as an argument, not to give Ukraine long-range weapons, for instance, because, well, what if Ukraine wanted to kind of take back what's theirs? So are these borders of nation states really that, saint for the modern kind of politics, for the more modern societies?
Yeah, I mean, in many respects they are, and they should be, because this is the way how world has been built after the Second World War. Until the Second World War, we had the essentially still attempts to create empires, and Nazi project was an imperial project. It was Lebensraum, getting as much space and territory as possible. Borders were irrelevant. So after the Second World War, a nation state has become the ultimate and dominant form of organization, of political and territorial organization. So now an empire is a negative thing. In the 19th century, empire was seen as a positive light. Now, it is delegitimized. So in a sense, the last attempt to create an empire was ISIS. ISIS tried to do that, to kind of carve territories of Syria and Iraq and create an empire, caliphate. So that's the problem with Russia. Russia is not just a threat to Ukraine; it's a threat to the world. Because it wants to reorganize the world in the way how it was in the 19th century. In along the imperial lines. And empires have no borders. Empires just have frontiers. They keep expanding. So that's why it's crucial. It is important that borders are not questioned unless there is obviously agreement between populations. But you are right that I think many Western politicians were very soft on Putin in 2014. They were very soft on him because ultimately Putin provided them with energy, with gas and oil. And Germany, obviously, Angela Merkel played an important role in that sense, being fairly soft, officially, obviously not recognizing occupation of Crimea, but tolerating it in a sense. And that was dangerous precedent because it did allow this kind of behavior. And we know, that this regime has been very much built through war, from Chechnya, from participation in 2018 Georgia, from Syria, from anywhere else. So simply, this is not a war only, for Ukraine's territory. It is for the world as a whole. It is about preserving the order that has been established after the Second World War.
So then, in order to, make correct decisions, you have to know these things. And, certainly, that's scholar's job. But how do you then discover things and study the country that is that there's no access to, right? Is it possible that we and politicians in the world are so misinformed and know nothing about the country, that filters everything that, leaves its borders? Is there a danger to that? Have we and has the West made these mistakes because maybe there was ill intent, maybe there was corruption, but maybe they were just misinformed? How do you then, as a scholar, make conclusions about a country that is so closed off?
Yeah. No, I mean, it is very difficult to do this. But again, we do have studies on North Korea, which is even more closed society. We did, have studies on Soviet Union during the Cold War period. It was not easy to do that, but there were studies and there were people, kind of sending information, samizdat and all of these kind of things, how it was done. So in today's world, we obviously have technology, much more advanced technology that allows us to do certain things. It's difficult. It's not easy, but it's still possible. So I think, scholars, I mean, you can still maintain contacts with some Russian academics if they want to, and if they are kind of willing to.
Do they want to?
But I'm thinking, more in terms because of if they are perceived as kind of collaborating, working with Westerners, that it is dangerous for them. So in a sense, it's but these things are still happening to some extent. So it's not completely closed off. But obviously, it's not easy to do that in an authoritarian society that is also fighting war at the same time.
That is very interesting. Is there anything else? Maybe you could give us an idea whether any of your books maybe someday will, be available in Ukrainian so we can read more about these things?
Yes, so this new book, Why Humans Fight, should be available in Ukrainian. We are currently talking with the translator and potential funders. So I'm hoping that this book will be available in Ukrainian. My other books, they are available for free. I mean, people can go to my website and find them. Sociology, War and Violence, which has been used there in English, and The Rise of Human Brutality, which looks kind of historical transformational violence, which people can read. They can access them for free, but they are in English.
Siniša, it was a pleasure having you here. Dear viewers, I want to remind you that today you were with Siniša Malešević, a professor and chair of sociology at the University College in Dublin, and myself, Melaniya Podolyak. Please, if you enjoyed this podcast, leave a like. And if you didn't enjoy it, you can always express it with a dislike button. And hopefully I will see you next time.